Hello again everyone, welcome to the second lecture on the Bloody Chamber. We're going to be looking today at the short story The Bloody Chamber, so before we go any further with the lecture, can you pause, go away and read it. It's 30 something pages long, probably take you about an hour to do so, and then come back and we'll analyse it together. So you've read the story. No, really, have you read it? Like the Snow Child, this derives from a traditional fairy tale. Unlike the Snow Child, you knew Snow White very well, probably. Charles Perrault's Bluebeard is the influence for the Bloody Chamber short story. It's probably one that you don't know that well. So, here's a little summary. Bluebeard is a very wealthy man who's got an unfortunate reputation. He also has what is described as a curious and unusual disfigurement. He has a blue beard. It's not really that bad as far as curious and unusual disfigurements go. He's got a really bad reputation because he's married several times and each of his wives has mysteriously disappeared. Now he's looking for the next wife, and a nearby lady, someone who lives nearby, has a couple of daughters, both of whom are used to living in luxury. Unfortunately, even though Bluebeard is very wealthy, they are repulsed by Bluebeards. However, one of the daughters is able to overcome her disgust at Bluebeards, partly inspired by the fact that Bluebeard's very wealthy. So already not a very feminist tale. Women are depicted as essentially as gold diggers. So she marries Bluebeard, and when she's living in his castle or mansion, depending on which version of the story you read, he says you can wander around, you can go into any of the rooms you like, except for this one that I have locked. Now the key to this room is going to stay over here in this place where you can easily access, but don't be curious, don't go through that door. Of course, she goes through that door, doesn't take her very long to succumb to her curiosity, and what does she find there? She finds all of the lifeless corpses of Bluebeard's previous wives. She's horrified, she tries to lock the door, pretend like she's not been there, but Bluebeard inevitably has his ways of discovering that she's been curious and she's gone in the room. Now, whether she escapes or not, that's up to you to find out. You can go away and read the original tale, but that's the essential premise and the basis of the story, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. You might want to pause at this point and have a go at this extension. Can you rewrite Bluebeard in a feminist way? There's often a crossover between fairy tales and Gothic horror, two genres that are very closely aligned, and Angela Carter in her collection explores that point of crossover. Gothic texts written during the late 18th and early 19th centuries share a number of typical features. They've got gloomy, imprisoning castles. They are set in a past medieval time when superstition reigned. They usually got a fearsome monster or a ghost that's threatening an innocent, virginal young woman, and the atmosphere oozes threat and fear. A quick rundown of some of the Gothic conventions that Carter uses in The Bloody Chamber. We might start with the colours, her white skin, blood-red jewels, the darkness of the night, and the cellar where the dead wives are kept. Passive femininity. Women are not allowed to fight back in either horror or fairy tales as we saw last time. And a villain, the Marquis. Carter may have chosen a typically medieval-seeming Gothic horror setting, but the choice of the Marquis as the tale's villain places the tale in an interesting, more modern context. We're looking here at revolutionary France. The Marquis de Sade was an aristocrat during that time. Most of the men in Carter's short story collection are aristocratic men. You've got counts, you've got dukes, and here we've got a marquis. So it could just be, well, he's a random generic marquis, except that in the year before Angela Carter wrote the Bloody Chamber collection, she wrote a series of essays, a book called The Sadean Woman and the Ideology of Pornography, in which she explored the treatment of women in the pornography written by the Marquis de Sade. That's how we know she's talking about that particular Marquis. One of the things you have to do in your English coursework is bring in criticality in the same way that you do with the Shakespeare text. So let's have a look at a critic now. Marina Warner interprets Angela Carter's version of the Marquis as an honest witness to the conditions of bourgeois marriage. Honest witness in the sense that he's a realistic depiction of what bourgeois, middle class, leisure classes, bourgeois marriage is like. He's an honest witness to the economics of sex relations, i.e. his characterisation proves that money buys you sex. And he's also an honest witness to the collusion of women with their own enslavement and subjugation. They play along with their oppression by powerful men. Do you agree with this? Look back at the tale, read it. Do you think this is what Carter's Marquis is? We'll look together now for evidence of Marina Warner's assertion in close analysis of certain aspects of the first half of the tale. The next lecture is going to deal with the ending of the tale. The narrator tells us that the Marquis's wedding gift clasped round my throat a choker of rubies 2 inches wide like an extraordinary precious slit throat. Now, follow with me these annotations and add any that you think are important to make as well. The verb choice of clasping in that first line implies that the Marquis owns the narrator, but it also alludes to strangulation, suggesting that he might kill her. The word throat is used instead of the word you might expect, the word neck. Usually chokers would go around your neck, not around your throat. This alludes to her death and her ultimate passivity, suggesting her strangulation. There is a hint, perhaps, in the use of throat of some romance, but that romance is very closely aligned with violence. We're going to talk about sadomasochism in a moment. The choker could allude to asphyxiation, foreshadowing the Marquis's plan for the narrator, but also to this sadomasochistic practice of sexual asphyxiation to heighten orgasm. Going round then, we look at the gift as being something that has been given, but of course gifts are also received. This is perhaps a hint that the narrator is complicit, that she colludes in her oppression. This quote is littered with the semantic field of wealth, which demonstrates her own part in the bargain, and the precious slit throat at the end of the quotation, its oxymoronic nature implies that again she's valuing this rough treatment that she's being given. Finally, I'll just ask the question, the word slit, does that remind us of anything? Perhaps it's a Freudian allusion. Perhaps it reinforces how sex and violence are intertwined. The word slit might also be a reference to the punk movement of the 1970s. Famously feminist band The Slits were active at the time. I wonder if Carter was inspired by them. Carter's narrative is clearly complicit in her own subjugation. She describes how I clung to him as though only the one who had inflicted the pain could comfort me for suffering it. The scene in which she says this is the moment where the Marquis is discussing going to New York with his agent, and it's never entirely clear if we're talking about the physical pain or the emotional pain that the narrator is experiencing. Either way, there is the sadomasochistic, taking pleasure from pain, sadomasochistic undertone of the one who had inflicted the pain could comfort me. The Marquis de Sade gave his name to sadomasochism. Now think about what the overall effect of this complicit behaviour on behalf of the narrator is. What effect does that have on us? How does the reader respond to the narrator here? Are we really sympathetic with her? She clearly is subjugated, clearly oppressed, clearly treated badly, but then she seems to be encouraging it. Are our feelings more complicated? Does Carter deliberately complicate the sympathies we would usually have for a fairy tale victim? Because that's essentially what the narrator is. Think also about which elements of this belong to the Gothic horror form. Words in the semantic field of torture, words like suffer, very clearly Gothic horror, but then we've got this much more introspective narrator than we would usually have in Gothic horror. What's the effect of that? I recommend that you pause the video, have a look at this quotation, and annotate it as much as you can for a couple of minutes. We'll have a look at one more quotation together, and then I'm going to give you some time to find a few more quotations from the first half that fit with the form and with the techniques we've seen so far. The third quotation we're going to have a look at together. He in his London tailoring, she, the narrator referring to herself of course, bare as a lamb chop. She's looking at herself here in the mirrors that surround the Marquis's bed, her marital bed. Most pornographic of all confrontations, and so my purchaser unwrapped his bargain. And, as at the opera, when I had first seen my flesh in his eyes, I was aghast to feel myself stirring. You might want to pause and ask yourselves these questions. Which language choices suggest the Marquis's economic power over the narrator? What's the effect of the narrative perspective? Which elements of this description belong to the Gothic horror form? And are there fairy tale elements to this description? Hopefully you picked up on the semantic field of wealth, including phrases like London tailoring, my purchaser, bargain. These words suggesting the Marquis is a man with power because he has money, and the narrator powerlessly is an object that he has bought. The narrative perspective makes an interesting shift with the word she. The third person pronoun suggests a distancing. The narrator dissociates from herself, doesn't describe the experience as if she herself is enduring it, rather describes it as if she's watching someone else. Maybe this is some kind of Freudian coping mechanism used to cope with the trauma of sex with the Marquis. Bare as a lamb chop, she objectifies herself. She goes further than just dissociating. She buys into, is complicit with this way that the patriarchy view women as edible objects. Here's something to extend your thinking. You're familiar with Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory, which of course comes from the world of cinema, where male directors, male actors, male characters look at women in an objectifying way. Laura Mulvey, of course, was writing this in 1975. In the same year, David Cronenberg released Shivers, a film which typically embodies his version of body horror, the idea of bodies being twisted and torn apart and weird blood things exploding out of them. Really quite disgusting, but gave birth to this no pun intended, gave birth to this idea of body horror in cinema, the idea that you can look and twist and objectify. And I wonder if the lamb chop that Carter's narrator describes herself as, well, it's definitely a form of the male gaze in action, but is there something Cronenbergian about it? Is it a form of body horror as the narrator is transformed into a chop? So the big evaluative question to ask yourself then is, are there fairy tale elements to this description as well as all the horror that we've seen? One fairy tale element that of course has been twisted here would be the transformation. Think about princes being turned into frogs, or is it frogs turned into princes? That is a traditional trope of fairy tales, and here of course we've got the narrator, perhaps metaphorically, perhaps slightly less metaphorically, being transformed into a chop. Are there other elements of fairy tale that you can see being used here, perhaps in a similarly twisted way? I want you now to go through the first half of the story, roughly the first 17 pages, and have a look then for at least five more quotations that you think are worth annotating in the same detail, focusing on the same kind of things that we've just looked at in those three examples. Pause the video, have a go at that now. We've looked at one critical interpretation of the Bloody Chamber text already, Marina Warner's. Let's counterbalance that now. Let's evaluate that using Angela Carter's own perspective of what she was doing in the tale. And we'll look at a quote from the Sadean Woman, that text that she wrote about the Marquis de Sade, as our lens to then pick apart what she's doing in this short story. Carter says that to be the object of desire is to be defined in the passive case. So, being desired as a woman, you have to be passive. You have to act passively. To exist in the passive case is to die in the passive case, that is to be killed. So if you accept a passive role, if you accept being something, someone, something that is desired, then you are giving up your personhood. You are giving up the thing that makes you a living, breathing person, a living, breathing woman particularly. She says this is the moral of the fairy tale about the perfect woman, and it sounds like she means that's what fairy tale writers were trying to convey. Of course, that's not what she's saying. What she's saying is that if we scratch the surface of traditional fairy tales, that's the moral that we as a modern, enlightened reader will find hidden under the surface. Thinking back to The Snow Child, Angela Carter used that phrase, didn't she? The latent content of traditional fairy tales. So this moral, don't be passive because to be passive is to die, that moral is hidden as latent content under the surface of the fairy tale narrative. That's enough discussion of the first half of the tale. I'd like you now to put this into some writing. So your piece of writing will begin with this phrase: with regards to the Bloody Chamber title story, critic Marina Warner asserts that Carter identifies the Marquis de Sade as an honest witness to the conditions of bourgeois marriage, the economics of sexual relations, and the collusion of women with their own enslavement and subjugation. To properly evaluate this critical position, I've given you four topic sentences, 4 paragraph starters here. I'd like you to write up these paragraphs. So the first topic sentence you'll write, Carter seemingly does explore the complicity of women to their own subjugation through the character of the narrator when, and I'd like you to use some examples, giving you some page hints there, but of course use the examples that we've picked apart first and foremost. Then your second paragraph, you can look at however, rather than seeing the Marquis as an honest witness, and you can explore then the alternative role that the Marquis plays. Third paragraph, you'll look at the idea of women being economically subjugated through marriage in more detail. And then fourth paragraph, you're going to bring it all together. Some could argue, however, that the narrator is not enslaved, but is in fact liberated through her relations with the Marquis, shown when. Now I want you to resist the urge at that point to look to the second half of the tale, even though you can make links if you want. Focus primarily on the evidence that you get from the first half, because yes, we know what happens at the end of the tale, we know she is ultimately liberated, but there are hints of her liberation within the marriage way before that, way before the ending of the fairy tale. So have a look to that first. That's the first half of our lesson on the Bloody Chamber short story. The second half, if you want to get a head start on that, you can think about Adam and Eve. How does the story of Adam and Eve from Genesis and the Bible link to the story we've been looking at? And Pandora's box, what's the connection there? Something to go away and think about, and I'll upload the next half of the lecture in probably a day or so. Take care till then. If you've got any questions, ping them my way on MS Teams, and I will see you soon.